So welcome to Science on Tap. Thanks, everyone. My name is Susan Knight. I work at UW Trout Lake Station up in Boulder Junction. And I want to remind you that Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, an idea from 1905 that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. We started Science on Tap so that we could get some science up here in the Northwoods, and it's built to be a discussion rather than a lecture for you to ask questions on a lot of different topics. And I want to remind you of all of our partners in Science on Tap: UW Trout Lake Station, Kemp Natural Resources Station, the Minocqua Public Library, and the Lakeland Badger chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and our hosts here, the Minocqua Brewing Company. So thanks to everyone there. And I also want to remind you that there are 4 ways to watch. You can watch right here, as you all are doing. You can watch at home online. Just go onto our website and click on Watch Live, and you can do it that way. We also have live streaming at the Minocqua Public Library and at least sometimes the Eagle River Library, but you better call ahead to double check on that. But for sure at the Minocqua Public Library. So you can do that live, and then later you can watch any of our archived videos. A couple weeks after the program itself, you can watch the whole thing. And then a few weeks after that, we will produce a 5 to 10 minute short version of this with a little bit of the introduction and a few questions. And so you can see those online as well. Just go to our website, Science on Tap Minocqua. You'll find it. And our next Science on Tap will be after the holidays, of course, January 3rd, and our topic will be private forest lands with Paul DeLong, who used to be the head of the forestry at the Wisconsin DNR. So he will know lots about forests. Tonight, we have Bilge Mutlu, UW-Madison professor of robotics and artificial intelligence in the Department of Computer Science. And Dr. Mutlu went to school in Turkey, and part of the time he was on the coast of Turkey where he had a beach. And I was telling him at dinner tonight, well, we have a beach, right? Pretty comparable. Not exactly the Mediterranean, but not bad. You can swim in it for 2 months, at least. He studied product design at university and worked a few years in the home appliance business in Turkey, and that'll be important later, so remember that. While at the home appliance business, he got involved with research and development projects, and he was beginning to explore the idea of smart and connected appliances. This led him to graduate school at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where he received his Ph.D. in human-computer interactions, focusing on robotic technologies. His research is less interested in automation as much as making human lives better and exploring some of the ethical issues involved in robots and human interactions. He incorporates artificial intelligence, robotics, human factors, and psychology into his designs. And Dr. Mutlu won the prestigious National Science Foundation's Career Award, and his work has been reported across the nation. So here's your trivia question for Bilge Mutlu. While working in the home appliance industry, remember this was in Turkey, back where he was born, he found some of the customers were pretty creative in finding new uses for some of his appliances. Which of the following was a modification his customers made to one of the appliances? Okay, 3 choices here. A, they made abstract art paintings by putting different colored paints into a blender and running it on high with the lid off and aiming it at a wall. B, they made tomato sauce by putting fresh tomatoes into a dishwasher and running the cycle and collecting the sauce out the drain. Or C, they used a clothes dryer on high heat to tumble dry small Mediterranean herring into crispy fish. Okay, your choices are the blender, painting with blender, tomato sauce, or crispy fish.
It's B.
Dr. Mutlu.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. Wonderful. So thank you for having me here. I'm excited to talk about robots over beer. And I'm also happy to be in an informal environment. Usually we do conference presentations and sort of talking about what keeps me up at night, other than my 6-month-old son who's right there. So I thought that I should start with some definitions and history to lay out some foundation for the topic that we'll be discussing. And we're here today to talk about artificial intelligence and robotics. So what is artificial intelligence? What is robotics? What are some associated concepts? Artificial intelligence involves computers and machines in general mimicking cognitive or thinking functions associated with human and animal minds, which you could call natural intelligence, in problems like learning and problem solving. The most familiar example of an artificial intelligence system is an email spam filter. So when your server or email client receives an email, it'll look at the contents and metadata that the email comes with to determine that that email is spam or not. A robot, on the other hand, is a machine with the ability to use these cognitive functions in a way that's situated in the physical world, such that it can sense the environment, make sense of its structure, make sense of the changes in that environment, make decisions with respect to its goals, and act on that environment. So the most familiar example of a robot is a robotic vacuum cleaner that many of you might have in your homes. And if you don't, these are the little circular robots that go around and sweep your floors. The robot senses the environment, senses that there is more dirt here than over there, and makes decisions about where to go and what to clean based on what it senses, and the decision-making model that's programmed into it. Now, there are some associated concepts to artificial intelligence that you might be hearing about and reading about. One term that we read about a lot these days is automation, which is the performance of a process or a procedure without human assistance. And usually automation requires little to no artificial intelligence and is set up to perform a very specific task under absolute certainty. An example of automation is an email autoresponder, like a vacation responder. When your email server or client receives an email and you've set up an autoresponder, the arrival of that email will trigger the response to be sent according to the parameters that you set. So there's no decision-making about whether or not to send the response, but sort of the trigger sets off the response automatically. Autonomy, on the other hand, involves a high degree of adaptation to unknown situations and decision-making capability. We've been reading a lot about autonomous vehicles and autonomous cars, and they are not automation systems. These systems integrate input from various sources to make decisions about what to do next, where to steer, whether or not to brake or speed up, or whether or not to engage the human driver. So hopefully these provide us with sort of the shared language to use in our discussion. And next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of AI and robotics. So where did robots come from? Who thought of artificial intelligence, and how were these related? Although robotics is now considered as only one application of artificial intelligence, historically, intelligence was seen as a necessary element of building robots, or early robots, what are usually described as mechanical automata. The idea of mechanical automata goes back to Greek mythology, specifically mechanical servants built by the Greek god Hephaestus. And we see several different visions, illustrations, and prototypes of automata that serve people in some form of fashion, including in ancient and medieval China, then in the Middle East by an inventor named Al-Jazari, then in Europe by Da Vinci during Renaissance, and then by a Japanese craftsman named Tanaka at the end of the 18th century. Our modern view of robots, and this is where the term robot comes from, was first depicted in a 1921 play called Rossum's Universal Robots by a Czech writer, Karel Čapek, where fictional automata worked in homes and factories as manual labor. The word robot comes from Czech and means compulsory labor. And it wasn't until the mid-20th century when we started actually seeing robots, initially with telemanipulation systems, where the robot transfers and replicates actions of a human operator. And later, humanoid and robot arms that started to integrate intelligence and complex decision-making by simulating natural intelligence. Throughout their history, robots and automata have been a fascinating concept from multiple perspectives. From philosophical, metaphysical, epistemological, and theological perspectives, it facilitates reasoning and discourse about what it means to be human, what it means to be alive, and what it means to know. From a scientific perspective, it gives us a platform to study the human body and human mind, as well as those of animals. And from a practical and technological point of view, it inspires ways of augmenting human capabilities. Of course, the most immediate perspective for all of us is in the technologies that are proliferating around us. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the practical and technological perspectives and explore the question of what we want robots to do. So what do we want robots to do? A common thread among the historical and modern views of robots is that robots and automata will perform dirty, dangerous, and dull work to serve or assist people. If you've seen the Discovery Channel show Dirty Jobs with Mike Rowe, all of the 300 jobs that they feature across the 8 seasons are excellent examples. So here are some interesting jobs. In season 1, they featured the job of someone who removes chewing gum and pigeon droppings from sidewalks. So that would be a dirty job, right? Then in season 3, they featured the job of an alligator egg collector. And while they were filming, the boat carrying the film crew flipped. And that would be a great example of a dangerous job. In season 7, they visit an onion processing facility. And again, in season 3, they feature a cranberry harvester. And these would be considered dull, repetitive work. And of course, there are jobs that are dirty, dangerous, and dull all at the same time, like spider collector and venom extractor, high-rise window washer, and incinerating toilet cleaner. So robots have been envisioned to do these jobs for us, and we see a massive industry growing around building robots that perform these functions. There are assembly line robots that are designed for factories, robots designed to clean gutters, sewers, pools, and the robots that feed pets, milk cows, and rock babies. In the last 2 decades, however, we've also seen growth in the vision for and development of robots that do jobs that are considered to be uniquely human, or at least traditionally, like teaching, therapy, coaching, and companionship, and to collaborate with humans instead of doing the jobs for them. So we're seeing, and we will be increasingly seeing, both robots that are off doing dirty, dangerous, and dull work for us in sewers, in mines, and in space, and robots that are working alongside with us in art environments and in ways that are collaborative. What happens when we place these technologies into the human environments? As in the 2 millennia history of human conception of robots, right now is the first time we're starting to see robots functioning around us in our day-to-day environments. As robots are being introduced into human environments and as we start interacting with them, what we're observing is that people relate to robots as social entities, not as cold, soulless, mass-produced pieces of machinery. And this is the case even for robots that are designed to do dirty, dangerous, and dull jobs. For example, think about the bomb disposal robots that are deployed with military units. When these robots break and are sent for repair, the soldiers explicitly say that they don't want a replacement for the robot. They want the same robot repaired and sent back. The robot is a part of their unit. They're deployed with the robot. They are emotionally attached to the robot. And in the last decade, I and my students have studied many such robot systems functioning in the real world. And what we've repeatedly seen is that when they are introduced into human environments, functioning in ways that humans function, and interacting with humans to do their work, they are treated as a part of the social environment, and as social agents with goals, emotions, and thought. Even though people are consciously aware of them being mass-produced, cold, and soulless pieces of machinery. For example, one of the robot systems that I studied as a part of my doctoral work about a decade ago was a robot making deliveries at a hospital. And no, it wasn't delivering babies. But it would deliver mail, lab samples, food, linen between different units of the hospital. When the robot arrived at a nurse's unit, for example, and announced its delivery in the middle of a phone call, the nurses saw that as being incredibly rude. So they didn't see it as a piece of machinery that was malfunctioning or that could be improved through design. They actually got upset that the robot would behave this way, just like they would with another employee. And there was an article in the news about the study that I conducted that was titled, "Useful, Lovable, and Unbelievably Annoying." And I think that nicely captures the complex and emotional ways in which people related to the robot. In another study that one of my former graduate students did of collaborative factory robots, these are robots designed to work side by side with human workers in close proximity. We found that people really wanted to chit-chat with the robot, which was not a capability built into the robot or even envisioned for it. But when we look at a factory, we see that these are extremely social environments. People's hands are busy with work, but their minds and social facilities are engaged in an entirely different activity, talking about their families, hobbies, and politics. And when a robot is introduced into that environment, there's an expectation that the robot will function both in physical and social ways, and that they become full members and participants of that environment. So in closing, Karel Čapek, the author of the 1921 play, said, quote, "Robots do not hold on to life. They can't. They have nothing to hold on with. No soul, no instinct. Grass has more will to live than they do." End quote. But what we're finding is that even when they're designed to have no soul, no instinct, and no will to live, we attribute these qualities, these human qualities, to robots and expect to see them. Perhaps it's because we see a reflection of ourselves in robots, or perhaps it's the only way in which we know how to relate to other beings. Whatever the reason is, our grand challenge and the challenge of artificial intelligence is realizing the vision for robots while meeting these expectations. And in our work, what we see is that the more we work to achieve this goal, the deeper the problem appears. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions and comments.
I've seen a lot of writing about how many jobs will be displaced and how it's going to upheave our society. What potential do you really see for that being the case versus some of the promises that artificial intelligence and robotics offer?
Right. I see this as a very complex topic. I used to be more of an optimist that with the introduction of these technologies, we would see much more benefit, and the benefit would offset the disadvantages or potential disadvantages or displacements that they would cause. I think the more we see them becoming a reality, the more complicated that space gets for me. So I'm no longer the optimist that I used to be. So I think we have to do the difficult work of not only coming up with these technologies, but also really understanding what it means for that technology to be introduced in any environment and how it's going to actually displace that environment. And part of the technology design has to be the policy design and the design and the considerations of the organization and all that going together. So I don't think with a disruptive technology like that, we can kind of just put it out there and leave it as it is.
So do you think that you think there will be any breaks with the development of this technology, or is it just going to proceed faster than our ability to deal with it?
Well, in my experience, the development actually happens in breaks, right? There's some kind of obstacle, technical obstacle, that people work to solve, and then at some point it is solved, and suddenly you see a rush of development happening. So we'll probably see these milestones happening as we have with technology so far. So, it's hard to predict, but if you look at the pattern of technology, it's always kind of happening in spurts. Certain things enabling other things to happen. But it's happening very fast. It's too fast even for me to follow. And this is what I do on a daily basis.
Another question?
So people are working on the robotic, the technical side, et cetera. Is there anybody working on the other side of this as far as what happens to workers, the psychology of it all, et cetera?
Right. So it's a very multifaceted problem, and so where I work is kind of right in the middle, taking in the technology and understanding the human side of things and kind of facilitating that transition. There are people who are more on the human side, really trying to understand the impact of technologies that are introduced. There are people who are on the technical side who are tirelessly kind of building the technology without thinking too much about what happens on the other end. So there's a spectrum of work that's happening. Economists study kind of labor changes as a result of automation. There are people who are thinking about sort of purely on the market end what's happening. There are also efforts in parts of my community about kind of planning for shifts in labor too. So if people are people's jobs are going to be displaced. If someone who works at a factory now needs to actually operate the factory, we can't expect the person to immediately download that knowledge into their brains and next morning start working. So how do you actually retrain and introduce this kind of training from a ground up point of view in K-12 education? So people are thinking about those problems too. We don't know if the technology is going to be faster than our ability to prepare for it, but I think a lot of us are aware of what the potential implications are and sort of thinking about solutions. But again, it's a lot of unknowns.
Thanks for entertaining this because I'm very far out of my bailiwick here, but I think where my mind tends to take me is that I would think that AI and robotics would be able to take us places where we wouldn't go. So that entertaining, this idea that we're using it to do very, well, it almost sounds like menial tasks to some extent, as you described it. And I don't know if it's concomitantly, but on the other, I would expect in this interface with humans that we, when I imagine us as a species in the future, that we might be quite kind of cyborged and, more computer-like or more AI-like. So, yeah, that's help.
Yeah. No, well, I think what you're referring to is that it's not just the technology that's changing and we're just kind of staying static. Humans are adapting to the technology too, right? You may have seen on YouTube, there are many videos of infants and 1-year-olds using iPads, and it's so natural. They're just moving stuff around much better than I do. And it just comes naturally to them, right? They talk about digital natives. So I think there's that co-adaptation that happens definitely.
Do you think that through AI they'd be able to understand emotion or program that in to robots or some other type of apparatus?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is generally talked about as general intelligence, so having kind of human-like intelligence. That's sort of what the eventual goal of artificial intelligence research is seen as. But practically, what we actually see is a lot of kind of narrow applications that are specifically designed to do a particular job. Right? If you think about an autonomous vehicle, it has many algorithms running on it. One algorithm dedicated to keeping the car, between lanes. One algorithm dedicated to tracking whatever is in front of you. One dedicated to watching, changes in weather, So it's a lot of stuff working together to achieve this very complex task of driving. And if you think about general intelligence, everything that a human mind does, it's a very, very complex space. So one day we might get there, but my general take on this is that not in my lifetime.
One of the most human characteristics that I can think of is creativity. Yeah. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on, the potential for AI systems to possess creativity, artistic ability, or the ability to invent something or, improve itself. Right. What do you think?
Right. Yeah, I mean, these are fascinating topics for AI researchers too, right? So, and actually they have been, right? So people have worked on those problems in a sort of a proof of concept way, right? So if you think about at a conceptual level, one could say, oh yeah, that's solved. People have done that. Computers have been creative. People have demonstrated computers to be creative. But when it comes to actual creativity in the real world, where would you actually have that, right? Any kind of real problem solving that a computer might do, a robot might do, it may learn some patterns of human problem solving, right? And then it might apply that to a situation that it's encountering for the very first time. So any kind of artificial intelligence is kind of an extension of natural intelligence and observations of natural intelligence in the past. So there's that. The other situation is I think there are a lot of human things that are only meaningful when humans are involved. Right? If a robot is going out to the desert and there's a creative problem there that it's going to solve, I don't know if I care if it solves it creatively or not as long as the problem is solved, right? But when it comes to interacting with people, working with people, and if there's some kind of creativity involved there, it's not clear to me that, as a creative human being, I want the robot to be the creative one in that setup, in that encounter. Right? So I feel like that's, at a conceptual level, yeah, it's an interesting problem. People have explored that, but in practice, it's a more complicated kind of, sometimes it may be important, sometimes it may be completely irrelevant. But again, going back to the general intelligence question, if a robot has general intelligence, will it also have creativity? Will it also have the ability to simulate and really kind of feel or understand emotions? Maybe, but I asked the question, why, right?
Just a general statement, comment. Which part of the world is going to benefit the most? Which country is on the cutting edge, further advanced? Is it developed countries like ours that are going to benefit more from robots, or third world countries that haven't built plants with old equipment that they're replacing?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question. I don't think there's a straight answer. So obviously, technologies will be first introduced to where they're developed, right? So there's no question about that. But another thing you see is that often when certain environments don't have infrastructure, they adapt it late, they often adapt the latest technology. So at certain points in time, you might see maybe a developing country having the more cutting-edge system than a developed country. But over time, over the bigger kind of broader perspective, you won't see that being the case because, if you're thinking about the U.S. context and, we're developing a lot of the technologies here, we'll be continuously developing technologies and implementing them. So that whatever is implemented here is also going to be changing. An environment, an organization, a company, a country can buy something and immediately adapt it. They would have the latest and best. But it's not clear that would sustain for a long time if it's not actually developed there.
Your discussion earlier regarding the interaction of the artificial intelligence with humans brought to mind the HAL 9000 in 2001. And on a serious note, have the researchers given consideration as to how far this can go and just how far we want it to go so that we still maintain some control over the situations, that it doesn't come back to bite us in the backside.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, what are the threats there, right? Again, going back to the general intelligence idea, if you have a robot that has general intelligence, that means that they have absolute intelligence and absolute creativity, and there's no way of stopping that. And that's, I think, one of the whys there, right? So, do you want a robot in your home to know everything about you, right? And if it does, who else knows that everything about you, right? And what keeps other people from knowing that? And I think these are very interesting questions. But I think just because the possibility is there doesn't mean that we will actually realize them, right? So even with thinking about general intelligence, thinking about a robot that knows everything, predicts every move you're going to make, even days ahead. Is that really necessary? Is that really what we want? So I believe that technology will reach a point of saturation, at which point we say, your intelligence is sufficient, and I don't want you to know more or think any further than that. At least that's what I predict.
Thinking about things like autonomous cars, systems developed to assist with moving patients in nursing homes. We are a litigious society. There are going to be lawsuits. Have you given any thought to how we should be looking at these things in a legal sense?
Yeah, very good question. So there are a lot of lawyers and academic lawyers who are interested in that topic. There are conferences specifically held for discussing these, right? Among academic lawyers, they're writing opinion pieces, policy pieces, talking to legislators. Even at state level, I talk to the state legislators sometimes. They propose a new bill around the use of robots in public places, and they consult with people like myself and get opinions on the legislator. So, I'm not a legal expert, and actually, I'm legal illiterate. You could put it that way. But I know that people whose expertise are in legal studies, they are thinking about these. They are actually thinking a lot further than where the technology is. They're asking questions like these, right? So if you have an autonomous vehicle that kills someone, where does the responsibility lie? Is it the driver? Is it the company that produced it? Right? Is it the programmer who programmed it? Is it the car itself? Right? Can you blame the car? Or is it the weather conditions? Right? Airlines say, well, what's the weather? We can't do anything about it. These are very interesting questions, and this is exactly what they're thinking about.
Hi. When I think of AI and robots, my mind goes to I, Robot by Will Smith, with Will Smith in it, and then the whole Terminator series with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Right.
What's the most humanoid robot that you've seen? Because there have to be people that are trying to make robots that look like humans. And conversely, which humans have got robot features on them? I think that type of thing has happened.
Yeah. Good question. Okay, there are lots of pieces there. Many people are trying to build robots that look exactly like humans. In fact, I as a graduate student, about a decade ago, I was involved in one of these efforts in Japan. So, at different points, different countries are kind of ahead of each other in development. And at the time, I didn't have access to a very advanced robot, so I went to Japan to do my work there. And I worked in a lab there where my supervisor professor replicated himself. So it's a full body replica made out of silicone, and then there's mechanics in it that made it move. And it was such that he would be sitting in another room, and his motions would be tracked and relayed onto the robot. And the robot would behave and talk, and they would relay his voice too. So the robot would appear like him, behave like him, and sound like him. And they've done many experiments like that. I've done some experiments using that platform. That was a decade ago. So there are many efforts to create very human-looking artificial systems. And I think these are kind of exercises, right? It's not that we're seeing all these robots and that's the eventual goal. Maybe some people think that that's the eventual goal, but I think these are interesting things to study. As far as your other question, how far along cyborg-like people. I mean, one of the things that people have no qualms about in terms of applications of robotics, unlike some other applications, is when you can augment someone's capability that they lost, right, or replace a capability that they lost. Someone's missing an arm, they're not able to walk, they're not able to do something, someone's ailing, and you can help them pick up a can of soup from a shelf, right? Those are, I think, the most, the applications that almost everyone gets behind, and there's always support for that. So we're seeing a lot of development there. You know, there are exoskeletons that you can get in if you are completely unable to move. It will enable you to move. There are bionic arms that, and again, I know very little about these because robotics is a very big area, and it's not my expertise. But you see that kind of like robot brought into this space of missed capabilities and then regaining them using technology. So this is sort of the new frontier in augmenting human capabilities and addressing disabilities and giving people basic, ability to deal with activities of daily life using robotic technology. So that, I think, is a sort of a big area and fast area. Yeah.
So thank you. I actually have a related question. One of the most interesting news stories I saw in a while related to this was that Saudi Arabia actually granted citizenship to a robot named Sophia who had artificial intelligence, and I watched the YouTube presentation of this person. And then there was some follow-up news story that I didn't actually read, it could be fake news, where they said that she wanted to have children. So she's been granted full citizenship rights of Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And obviously there's been a lot of debate over the years about corporations having rights like people. Suddenly you have an AI and a robotic developed by Hanson Robotics, I suppose is what it says here. What are your thoughts around that? So you've given citizenship to something that's made by man, programmed with certain limitations.
Right. I mean, I can tell you my personal opinion. I don't know what the legal or ethical community thinks about that. But I think that these are just like people experiment on the technology space by building their replicas. These are experimentations in the policy space and social space. We'll see examples we'll see news articles about it, but it's not going to be what's most prevalent, right? I don't think we're going to see half the US population being robots. So I think these are just kind of experiments, and they're interesting, and we can learn from them maybe, see how other people react to it. But I think that's the extent that I personally see it happening.
As we see technology continually disrupt various industries, like driverless cars, we're continually finding more and more people that are trained for a world that is rapidly disappearing.
Yeah.
So to supplement that, Silicon Valley has been talking a lot about basic income. What are your thoughts on how that is going to roll out in the U.S., or is that a viable option for us, or where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, my wife's an economist. She would be better able to answer this question, but I'll give it a try. So I think that's one of the ways in which I think Silicon Valley is sort of dealing with this problem. But that assumes that all sectors and industries are affected exactly in the same way, right? Which I don't think is going to be the case. I think we're going to see lots of shifts and really fast development in certain fields, right? Autonomous cars wasn't a discussion for a long time. There were autonomous cars 30 years ago, but it wasn't cars that dealt with day-to-day traffic. And then suddenly, certain advances were made, and that enabled a huge growth in that space. So I think what we're going to see is that there is going to be a lot of growth in this space, but not in other areas, so lots of sort of shifts in labor. And if any of the efforts that my communities are doing about retraining and training people for a future where AI is kind of what you deal with, what you interact with, that might fill in some of the gaps and at least smooth the transitions that are happening. So my sense would be that it wouldn't be a radical sort of societal level solution like basic income, because the industries are going to shift in different ways.
Yep, I was interested in one of the applications that you mentioned in your initial presentation. companionship and therapy. I read an article about robotic cats, I guess, in Japan. I have a cat myself, and I can't imagine relating to a robotic cat. But I just wondered if there were more specific examples other than robotic cats for companionship and therapy, and what they would be and how they work.
Right. Yeah, great question. This is actually more closely related to the work that I do. The example that I would give is there's a robotic seal, for example, and it's called Paro. It's developed by a Japanese researcher that I know. So that was the goal of that is a therapy robot for retirement homes, right? So you're living on your own in a retirement home, and you have this robot that you're sort of taking care of, and it, in an individual sense, what researchers have found is that when you're responsible for something, when you're taking care of it, when you actually have to charge this robot, otherwise it will kind of go dead, actually helps you kind of hold on to things. And in a social environment, having the robot respond to stimuli and things and behavior facilitates interaction within the group. Why is it a seal? It's an animal that we're not familiar with, so whatever it does is not that important, right? If you have a robotic cat and it doesn't act like a cat, you would think that that's a broken cat. With a seal, it's a seal, right? And the other thing is, why don't you have a real pet, right? Well, the robotic pet doesn't poop, right? You don't have to really take care of it, right? You have to sort of take care of it. So what they've done is that they've deployed this system, this robot, in Japan and countries in Europe, and they've done clinical testing and shown all these kind of psychological improvements in these communities that they've tested with. So there's even clinical data that shows that these companionship and therapy robots are effective in some way.
Hi, thank you. This is very interesting. So when you talk about what's happening in the U.S. and the studies in the U.S., and then you mention occasionally Japan as being another competitor, if you will, I'm interested in knowing what other countries are making advancements and how do we measure up with them? And are we working cooperatively at all with other countries?
Sure, yeah. I would say that, well, if you take Europe as a monolithic country, Europe is another place, mostly Western, Southern, and Eastern Europe. The US, Canada, Japan, and South Korea, and a little bit New Zealand and Australia. So that's sort of the majority, I would say 90% of the research comes from. The US is, I would say it's really leading the pack. I think Europe comes second, and Japan is the next, mainly because of the volume too. It's a smaller country than the rest of Europe, so there are fewer researchers. But I would say that these countries have very different approaches to robotics. The way that we've been thinking about robotics in the US and Japan, for example, are very different. And the Japanese society have a very different view and acceptance of robots. They're actually much more welcoming of robots than we are. In the US, I think sort of, it depends on the generation from which a person is coming from. But it's seen as sort of the killer robot, and people have a lot of suspicion about robots in the US still. In Japan, they're actually welcomed as kind of as these characters that are part of your life. And because of that different perception of robots within societies, they also look at different applications, right? So in Japan, for example, for the longest time, they looked at elder care applications, companionship, robots that were human-like and social, that talked with people, and they saw that as kind of this enrichment of their lives and bringing the social character into the fold. And in the US, we had been building bomb disposal robots and robots that did stuff, right? So there was this kind of disparity that was happening, and I think in the last decade, I would say that it's been equalized a little bit more. in the US too that we're thinking about applications in health and companionship and therapy and all that. Same with Europe. And the way that funding works is also quite different. In Europe, for example, robotics research is funded through massive EU grants, and in the US it's a little bit different. It's a little bit industry, some government support. Yeah, I mean, I would say those are the countries, but the style of research is quite different. I would say, like, I work in the US, I collaborate with people from countries like these, but I would say that we have the most advanced research.
A question online. I have a question from online.
Oh, great.
Are there any examples of where robots can solve human work shortage problems, such as menial household tasks?
I feel like the shortage problems are generally kind of fixed through the market itself. But there are some situations where the market is not responding. One example I can give is a lot of colleagues that I have work on developmental disorders. So, for example, if you have a child with autism, they usually need upwards of 9 hours of direct interaction with a therapist a day. And dedicating a full therapist, and that the health system can't respond to that. There's no way that amount of time can be spent. So that's one place where bringing in a kind of a structured activities using a social agent can have that benefit, can fill in that gap. So there are kind of these very interesting areas where the shortage is not filled just because the way that things are set up. And the other thing I would say is that a lot of applications that I look at and my colleagues look at are situations where there isn't really a replacement for a human. It's more kind of an augmentation, or it's providing supplement, right? So if you, for example, my student and I developed this reading companion robot, and it helps children read more and set goals and kind of better connect what they're reading to the other readings they've had. And reading is a solitary activity, right? It's not really replacing a teacher. It's not really replacing a parent. It's really trying to augment the activity of reading. So I think thinking about so what are things, unique niches that we can fill in, and where are situations where we can augment existing structures, existing work. Those are kind of more interesting to us, at least the way that I see it.
Yeah, Doctor, you mentioned exoskeletons before, and it's really not your cup of tea, but they had a company on one of the morning business programs a couple of weeks ago. It's called Exobionics, and they make exoskeletons for a lot of different applications. They showed one guy at a Ford Motor Company that has to do this repetitive action on the bottom of a car 432 times for an 8-hour shift.
Wow.
And this exoskeleton he had on made it virtually weightless or zero weight-free, so he could do that very easily, didn't have shoulder problems, didn't have arm problems, didn't have neck problems, and he even had one of the cameramen on the TV program that put it on and said it was incredible. I thought one of these things would cost $50,000, $100,000. It's $7,500. That's all it was. But their end game, this company called Exobionics, their end game is not only for this, but on their website it shows health applications, and their end game is helping people with strokes.
Sure.
Yeah. Now, we talk about the cat, the artificial intelligence cat. If somebody could feed themselves that couldn't feed themselves before, their value of their life should be, even with this very simple robotic type of thing, greatly increased.
Right.
Where do you see those type of applications coming along? Because I would imagine 20 years ago, something like this would have cost $500,000. Right. Now it's $7,500. Where do you see that entering our lives to help us do things that we really need to do to keep ourselves not going to nursing homes, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, so, an exoskeleton is, I think, is one solution. There are other solutions that don't involve augmenting your body in any way. One of the things that we've worked a little bit on, and other people are working on, is imagine that on your kitchen countertop there's a robot arm, and there are a few things that it can do. It can set up a dinner table for you. It can clean up after you. Maybe if it can even help you eat it if you can't do that yourself. People have tried. Someone wants to shave and they can't. How do you do that? Telepresence applications are pretty common. If you couldn't be somewhere, if someone who couldn't make it to this talk, can we have a robot in the corner that someone can log on to and then drive around, see the talk, interact with other people? And that's actually a real-world application that's out there that you can buy and use, and it's cheap. The way that technology progresses is that lots of people are working on these kind of unique and interesting applications, and an advancement in one of them kind of pulls others together and pushes. And when investment is there, when companies are interested in putting that out, becomes a cheaper technology and gets out there. I think we're gonna see these kind of pop up, right? There will be a kitchen counter robot that will do all these things for you. There will be a robot that's attached to a wheelchair, so as someone on a wheelchair, you don't have to try to reach to open doors anymore, right? The robot can do that for you. So I think that's really a huge target for robotics, and it's actually a sort of a nearby target, right? In the near future, we will probably be seeing those applications well before many of the other applications I talked about. Very, very exciting stuff, right? You can't eat, and now you can, right? That's amazing. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, is machine learning different from artificial intelligence? And can you talk about how machine learning works? Like, is the computer reprogramming itself, or how does it work?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm not a machine learning expert, but I can answer that question. So artificial intelligence is a general term that encapsulates a sort of a computer or a machine representing sort of thinking functions, right? That's the general term. Not all artificial intelligence systems will use machine learning. Machine learning is a set of techniques using data that's collected from a particular context to build a model of that context, right? So imagine that I want to somehow teach a computer to differentiate between a salt shaker and a pepper shaker. And what I do is I don't want to limit it to any type of particular design of a salt shaker and pepper shaker. I show the system multiple examples of that, and I said, this is salt shaker, this is pepper shaker, and I do that 1,000 times with various different shakers. And over time, the system will learn what they look like, learn its features. Oh, okay, so if it's white, it's generally salt, right? And then when the system sees new instances of that in the future, it will say, well, what I learned, my model says that the light one is the salt shaker, so therefore that's salt. So this is often called supervised learning, so you're showing examples to the system. There's also unsupervised learning, where you just put things in front of the system, and over time, by looking at differences, understanding and clustering things, it will learn that it's looking at two different things. It won't know that one is called salt, one is called pepper, but it will know over time that they are different. And when you show an instance of salt shaker in the future, it will know that it's of the same class that it saw before. Right? It won't know that it's salt, but it'll know that it's of the same class. So that's unsupervised learning. And there are various methods that fill in the space, but it's generally learning from data, learning from prior observations in order to make predictions about the future. And that's how these systems work, right? When an autonomous car is driving down the highway, the lane lines that it sees, it's been trained to recognize those lane lines because it saw lots and lots of examples of those lines. It's been trained to recognize that what a merge looks like because it knows what a vehicle looks like. It knows what a merge behavior looks like because it's seen lots and lots of instances of that. And if you look at how humans learn, that's how babies learn, right? They explore the environment, they touch things, they get lots of exploration, lots of examples to learn from. If they're doing something for 1,000 times, they actually start predicting what's going to happen in the 1,001st time. So they start they do the machine learning or the natural learning, and then they can predict what's going to happen next. So that's sort of really kind of taking that into the machine, to the computer, to enable the computer to deal with the human environment by learning from past observations. Yeah.
What's the most far-fetched thing that you've heard about down the road, 20, 30, 50 years, that sounds...
Actually, Hank described it as general intelligence, right? So having full-on human intelligence, I think, is the most far-fetched thing. And that's very, very challenging.
Yeah, because I mean, I remember the things that developed, and it's almost the speed of development. I mean, just having computers, how much faster, instead of a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, it's 3 years, 5 years. Almost anything you buy that's computerized, technology advanced, it's obsolete in 7 to 10 years.
Yeah.
It just, because it's, but I remember some of the things I heard about 30, 40 years ago, even with cell phones. 30 years ago, they said, you know, invest in cell phone towers, that everybody will have a cell phone. It's like, that's when they were bag phones 4 feet wide, and you know, had reception for 10 feet. And it's, you know, and now everybody has one. Every high school kid, everybody has one.
Right.
And I haven't heard of any really far-out technology that you can see that what it means something. I mean, I can see artificial intelligence, what you were talking about, but you can't see a concept down the road of what it actually will do that seems unimaginable.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's unimaginable, right? So I'm guessing that no one has imagined that. One of the interesting things about technological progress is not just that the rate in which things are getting smaller and lighter and faster, but actually our adaptation to them, right? So if you told someone that there will be a computer much more powerful than the computer that you know, the military used in the 50s in your pocket, they'll be, why? Why do I want that, right? There would be a computer in your kitchen. There would be a computer that you can use while you're sitting on the toilet. Why, right? So I think most unimaginable things are about human practices about technology use. We don't know what we're going to want to do. And we don't know what, when technologies appear in our hands, how we'll actually appropriate them and use them, and you know, what we'll do with them. So that's kind of a question. And one of the things that I think I find, and I really kind of push this as an approach, is that we're talking about technologies that never existed. They've been envisioned, people talked about them, but they're kind of really vague concepts. Only by putting them into the real world and observing what happens, we can actually know what we should do with them, whether or not we should do them, and kind of to predict, you know, how people will accept them, use them. So kind of this incremental development, but carefully building something, putting it out there, see how it's going, and sometimes bring it back and put it back out. That's really the progress, I think, in which things happen more effectively and more successfully. Yeah.
We have a question online.
Yeah, kind of the opposite question. What robot do you think almost everyone will have in their home in the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's the vacuum cleaners. They're great. I mean, we've had one for 5 years. It's been running, and I don't think we could survive with all the pet dander, you know. Yeah. So I mean, going back to the dirty, dangerous, and dull, right? So whatever can do that, it's great, right? So a sewer robot, would you really want to clean the sewer yourself rather than the robot? Would you want to clean the gutter and you know, risk of falling than the robot? So I think there are applications where it's no-brainer. Absolutely, this is good for me, easier for me, good for my health. Just let it do it.
Here's a fun one for you. Our culture is consumed with spectacle. Will there ever be a day when it's Samsung's AI versus Microsoft, or Google versus Amazon, and we'll all Sunday afternoon sit down and see who's got the best AI this year?
Yeah, absolutely, that will happen, right? You already see their chess competitions. I don't know if you saw, but recently a computer beat the world's Go champion, which many people thought was unbeatable or impossible just a few years ago. And that sort of shows the state of the art in AI. This was enabled with deep learning, and this was not something that people thought would happen 5 years ago. So absolutely that's going to happen. People are putting chatbots out there so it can learn from people and talk to them. And they put their company's names on them, right? So like IBM has the Watson that plays the chess. And so that's absolutely going to happen, and it is happening. So.
Any other questions? So currently, the industry, almost all the industries are being introduced to collaboration bots or like the cobots. As far as like the academia goes, where does the computer science or computer engineering folks are focusing on as far as like the algorithm and like what is the main focus?
Yeah, good question. So how does the industry and academia kind of where are they and how are they interacting? It's kind of an interesting space because so if you look at a lot of the end user computer technologies that we're using, you look at the history of that, you see academia and industry going just kind of like side by side on parallel tracks, sometimes interacting with each other, using each other's work. And in robotics, too, we see that it's really a complicated space, so it's hard to kind of build a parallel. But they're going on parallel tracks, focusing on slightly different things, right? So the industry is really, they need to get robust working robots up and running out there that are cheap, reliable, that are easy to program, easy to use, right? And they are using lots of data, lots of machine learning, lots of fine-grained optimization to make that happen. On the other hand, in academia, we're focusing on problems that are really hard to solve, that are that the industry doesn't have time to focus, spend 2 years on. What are sort of some of the fundamental roadblocks that we can solve so that when you have the really reliable, really working, easy to use, easy to program robot, we can actually kind of merge these ideas together and really do something new. So I think that happens quite a bit. So people focusing on different things. And what I said about sort of like, putting out these robots that work, that is really happening at a fast rate. For example, 5-6 years ago, buying an arm robot that you could control that could do things that were safe was not easy. They didn't exist. Now we have 3 of them in my lab, and they are low cost and they're easy to program. My students are competently using them. This is like a dream. 10 years ago, you couldn't even think about that, and that's enabled by industry, by building that. But at the same time, we're doing things with them that industry is never going to have the time to explore, right? And the papers that we publish are kind of inspiration for them to think about applications. So it's kind of like it's kind of ping pong, right? We're passing things, knowledge back and forth to do something bigger.
All right.
I have one last question.
Okay.
As the person said before, iRobot. There's lots of literature and movies and things like that that deal with the tension between humans and robots.
Right.
Do you have a favorite and that you think captures that tension between humans and artificial intelligence?
Interesting question. Yeah. I mean, generally, I look at these very skeptically, and it's like, come on. I think that I think the name of the movie is Frankenrobot. This is this movie where an older person is living on his own in the woods, and his daughter is really concerned about him. He buys him a humanoid robot, and the robot shows up at his home, and he is really skeptical of technology. He really doesn't want this thing. He's going to get rid of it. But over time, he kind of develops a likening to the robot. And the older gentleman is his profession is he's a thief. So he kind of teaches the robot how to steal things and help, and they built this relationship. And one day, somehow, the robot has to be taken away from him, and you see this kind of emotional connection, and the man really being, just feeling that tension, right? Like this thing I was extremely suspicious about, now I love this thing, and how do I reconcile that, right? I think that's my favorite, I would say.